Welcome back to Teach, Assess, Learn, the podcast from the Center for Teaching and Assessment of Learning at the University of Delaware. I'm Dr. Rose Moravchik, the Assistant Director of CTAL, and I'm here joined with my colleague,
Dr. Kevin Guidry, Senior Research Analyst at the Center.
We're here to talk about our latest First Friday Roundtable. The topic was documenting your teaching for promotion and tenure. And we were joined by a panelist of 3 faculty members, and our remarks were introduced by Matt Kinservik, the Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs. And Kevin, you want to introduce our listeners to our panel?
Yes, so this particular panel is one we put together every year, and we have faculty who have been recently promoted so they can talk about their experience in the recent past. So our first panelist was Sri Baldona. He has been promoted to full professor. He works in hospitality and business management, and he was hired here at UD originally as assistant professor. So going up for full professor, that was his second time through the P&T process. So he had a little bit of additional insight to share. Stephanie Hansen was our second panelist. She's an associate professor in theater, and she's also a member of the Faculty Senate's Promotion Tenure Committee. So as a part of that committee, she's read a lot of dossiers because that committee sees all of them and actually votes on all the dossiers that are submitted for promotion. So she had some very good insight to share from that. And our third panelist was Mike McCamley, who is now an associate professor in English. And he had a lot of interesting insight to share, not just as a person who has gone through this process recently, but also as a person who teaches writing for a living. That's what his research area is. That's what he does. So he had a lot of good insight to share from that.
And the structure of this roundtable was fairly open. The idea was to get a lot of questions from our attendees. We had our panelists share some of their experiences from the P&T process with regards to documenting their teaching, and then opened the floor for people to ask questions about how the process works. So we have a couple of points to share with you today in our podcast. We're going to start with talking about the policies and procedures for P&T and how to get the ball rolling on familiarizing yourself with those procedures. Then we're going to talk about some of the anxieties around student evaluations of teaching when we get to the documentation process. And then we're going to end with some suggestions from Michael McCamley about how to get started on documenting through that teaching narrative. So 3 main points we'd like to cover today, and we'll end with some resources for you to follow up on your own. And if you have any questions, you can always get in touch with us. We'll let you know at the end how to start that process. So Kevin, you want to tell us about the process for documenting your teaching for P&T?
So our panelists were telling us that there are a couple of things to keep in mind through this process. One is you have to address the actual written policy that's been established by your department, by your college, by your university. So there are policies that say you must include these things in your dossier, and you really do need to include those things. You include other things probably, depending on what your policy says, but there's a minimum bar, and there's a set of common expectations that are shared for everybody going up for promotion or tenure, and those policies are written down and available, and you need to know those. But there are also things that may not be written down that you probably don't know unless you've gone through this process or unless you've made friends with people who have. So that's what you need to be doing. It's establishing well before you get into this process is build out your network of people who can provide you with feedback and tell you not just about the process was like this when I went through it 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago, but also here, let me take a look at your documents, let me provide you with feedback, or realistically, here, I'm giving you my materials, please provide feedback. I would really like to hear from somebody. And what you want to do is get people that are from your discipline in your department, but you really also need people that are outside of your discipline, outside of your department, because these documents have many different audiences. You're writing for the specialists who understand deeply what you do because they have the same background, and you're writing for people who are in a wildly different discipline who will not understand the jargon, the important issues. So you need to write for those people as well and provide them the appropriate context to understand what you're doing in all parts of your dossier, not just the teaching part, but in the research and the service as well. They need that context to understand the importance of what you do, why you do it, and how you did it.
And that's a great point that this is a collaborative process at some level in the beginning. You need to understand from your peers what they've done. You need to be sharing ideas, sharing your work, getting feedback, working on that revision, because excellent documentation can't happen in a vacuum. You can't write this alone. No one person is an island in documenting their teaching. And so getting feedback, seeking out feedback from your colleagues, whether it's on the written documents, whether it's having a peer observe your teaching, that's a really important part of the process that will help you be successful in making a strong case about your teaching for these varieties of audiences who'll be looking at your materials.
So one of the specific, I'm going to say it's a specific question, but it was many questions around the same topic, was, so what do I do with these results of the student surveys? They're usually called student evaluation of teaching. They're not really evaluations,
right,
but that's what they're often called. The surveys that you give at the end of class, or that you're, in many cases, required to give at the end of the semester to ask students for feedback. What do we do with those?
Because everybody's gotten them where there's contradictory remarks, right? Some students will say, this is the best class I've ever taken. I learned so much. Others will say, I could barely stay awake. You'll get comments which are all over the map. Sometimes you'll get really difficult, challenging comments, and something that you thought was going to be a great and effective teaching tool maybe didn't hit the mark that semester. So we had a lot of questions about how we use this information, this data we get back from our students, in a way that is meaningful and can demonstrate our commitment to excellence in teaching.
So there are two general answers to this question of what do I do with these. One, in some ways, you're going to be told what to do with them. Your department, those policies, those guidelines are going to tell you, you must include this in there. In some cases, for example, our College of Business requires that all of these are included, and they're not a selection, not a sample, but all of these materials are included as part of your dossier. So in some ways, some of the questions or some of the answers are provided by the actual policy, but you also need to think about, how do I work these into a larger narrative? How does this inform, how does this shape the larger narrative arc of my teaching? What have I done with these students, the student input, this feedback that they've given me? What did I do with it?
Yeah.
What you would like to be able to do, what you should be able to do, is to talk about how you got these comments, you got this feedback, and then you did this as a response or as a result of what they told you, especially if it's negative, especially if this is a catalyst for improvement or motivation to change something. That's a really important, interesting part of your story as a teacher.
And Stephanie Hansen, one of our panelists, made the point to say it's always really impressive from the review standpoint to see someone demonstrate, look, I got comments after this semester that students said this wasn't working, that something needed to change in my teaching. I listened, I took that feedback, and I put it back into the class the next time I taught it and made these changes. So using that as evidence of your responsiveness as a teacher actually goes a really long way with this review process to say, hey, I care about improving my teaching, and I want to use this feedback from my students to improve what I'm doing the next time I teach this course or teach a different course. So there's lots of ways to manage these student evaluations, which can often be very stressful, but there's ways to put that context in your teaching narrative that will show a fuller picture beyond just a couple of data points or some numbers on a scale. This is about a larger body of your work as an instructor.
And remember that everybody who is reviewing your dossier is somebody that's taught many, many times.
Yeah.
So they understand that there are outliers, that there are students that provide comments that are less than helpful or that are just completely enigmatic and you don't know what to do with them. They understand that you don't need to worry about people not understanding the nature of this process and these comments. They totally get it. So you don't need to worry about that.
Everybody has that one extremely negative student evaluation that was so bizarre they put it on their fridge or they left it up in their office because you just don't understand what you're supposed to get from that piece of feedback. So everybody here has been part of this process before.
So what you need to do is, again, incorporate those student comments just like you do for all of your other materials, just like you do with the student artifacts that you have collected. If you have examples of drafts of student work and final versions of that same student work where you can show improvement on behalf of the student, not improvement on your own behalf, but as a result of the course that I taught, look how much the student improved or changed throughout the semester. Look what I did when I taught this class this year, and then 2 years later I taught the same class, and here are the two syllabi, and let's compare them, and I'll talk about what I changed and why I changed that. But all of this goes into a larger narrative of who you are as a teacher and where you started from however many years ago, 5, 7 years ago, and where you are now, and what happened in the meantime, how you got to where you are. So Mike McCamley had some specific suggestions about how you might start to think about crafting that narrative arc. So one suggestion that he had specifically, actually a couple of suggestions, but one specifically talked about something we may have mentioned earlier. So originally your department. Your department is the first place that's receives your dossier. So you put together a dossier and you submit it to your department, and they review it, vote on it, write up a summary of what they believe, what they voted on, what they think should happen, and then that goes on to other folks, to your dean, to the provost, and other folks. So you could try writing that letter for them. Think about, what do I think this letter should say? What do I want it to say? And draft it. That's a tactic that we use, or that I at least use, and I know many other people do as well, with grad students ask for letters of recommendation. And they're asked them to draft it, not just as a way of pushing it off and making less work for myself, but it's actually a really good way of getting somebody to really think about, so what should this say? What would I like somebody to say about me?
Yeah. One of Mike's other suggestions, which will be a familiar reference for those of you who used to watch VH1 on cable television, was to craft a document where you write about yourself as if you were on VH1's Behind the Music. Basically, what would other people say about you if they were being interviewed about your teaching? What are the things that they would highlight and point to as really envelope-pushing, memorable moments from your teaching? It sounds kind of silly, but if you make a lighthearted kind of exercise out of this, you might find that you're going to come up with specific anecdotes that are really going to enliven this teaching narrative. And it's also a really fun way of approaching this when it's challenging to talk about yourself. It can be really hard for us to kind of tout our own accomplishments with regards to teaching, and this is a fun way to get you started on that process.
And finally, a very common, very kind of naive, simple way of approaching any written document, but it's also a very effective way, is just to write your first messy draft. Just write out everything. Just think about all the stuff that you've done as a teacher. So think about all the classes you've taught. Think about all the other teaching things you've done that aren't necessarily class-related or it takes place in a classroom. What kinds of teaching have you engaged in? And what was notable about some of the classes that you've taught? So just get it all out there. Just vomit it all out into a couple pages and see what it looks like. And then once you have it there, then you can start deciding what to keep, what you need to reorganize, how you can start to bring that into some sort of cohesive picture. How do you get things to connect?
For those of you who are earlier on in this process, you can take some of that work out of the game for you early on and start doing a journal and start keeping short little reflections about your teaching right after they happen, right after that class session that went really well. Write down what you think was effective. And that way, when you get to this stage later in your career, you have a running log of things. That messy draft has in some ways already been created for you. We have so many other things we could talk about in documenting your teaching for promotion. So we'd just like to give you a couple of tips for resources and then let you know how you can follow up with us. So the first thing, as we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, was making yourself aware of policies and procedures. So for that, you're going to want to go to the website for the Office of the Provost. And on that website, under the Resources tab, there is a section on faculty policies. And under there, you'll find all of the individual specific college and department documents for P&T. We also, on our own website, ctal.udel.edu, you go to the Teaching tab, and under there we have a link for documenting teaching. We have suggestions for what should go into your teaching dossier, as well as a document from the CT Faculty Caucus about demonstrating teaching effectiveness. We also will have a handout which we made available for this session with some questions to get you thinking about what goes into your teaching narrative. And, as always, we're available. Right, Kevin?
We are. That's what we do.
It's our job.
That's what we love doing. So if you need some specific consultation, if you need some advice, some feedback, we'd be happy to provide that for you. If you would like somebody from outside of your department to come into your classroom and observe your teaching and provide you with confidential feedback that you may or may not include in your dossier, it's up to you. We'd be happy to do that as well. So we'd be happy to help. We just need you to let us know.
So pay us a visit in Gore Hall, send us an email, call us on the phone, and we're happy to help you get started or continue the process of documenting your teaching for promotion and tenure. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us in the next couple of months. We have our first Friday Roundtable in May coming up, and also the Summer Faculty Institute to look forward to. So stay tuned for more information about that, and thanks very much.